Tēnā koutou. Welcome to this talk on the Tauranga Bond Store, which is located at number 1 The Strand in Tauranga. So if you're not familiar with this building, here's a photograph of it taken around the 1960s as it used to look. And it's not too different from how the original building looks today. It's located at the very northern end of the Strand, directly below the Monmouth Redoubt and police station. It's easy to miss if you normally drive through Tauranga, so if you ever have the chance, take a stroll down here at some stage. It's well worth a look. The reason for this talk is because we have an archive collection labelled AMS 12 Guinness Brothers. It's stored at the Tauranga Library and is viewable by request. It can also be viewed online via our Paikōriki online archives website. It's named Guinness Brothers because it was in this family's possession at the time of donation by Colin Johnston, a former general manager of Guinness Brothers business, and he was also husband of Betty Guinness. It contains a wealth of material, manuscripts, correspondence, photographs, and some other items, some of which are over 100 years old, so it offers a glimpse of business life in Tauranga during the later 19th and early 20th centuries, and of some significant decisions for Tauranga. So why is it so interesting? Well, the Tauranga Bond Store is a Historic Places Category 1 listed building. So this building and the site it sits on represent significant value for Tauranga Moana. Also, as we'll come to see, having the Bond Store in Tauranga was significant for the continuance of the Port of Tauranga. A sketch by Horatio Gordon-Robley, a military artist, gives you an idea of how the land looked in the 1800s. Originally, Ngaitirangi inhabited the cliff area at the northern end of the Strand, known to Māori as Taumatakahoai Pā. However, it was abandoned in 1828 after a devastating attack by Ngāti Maru from the Thames district. The Church Missionary Society established a permanent mission station around 1838 with Reverend Alfred Nesbitt Brown as its head. In 1864, soldiers arrived and rebuilt the fortifications on the site, which became known as the Monmouth Redoubt instead of Taumatakahoai Pā, its original name. The battles of Gate Pā and Tauranga in 1864 sealed the fate of the district. Most of the land purchased by Brown for the CMS was taken by the government as the site for the town of Tauranga, which was surveyed in 1867. This opened up the land for European settlement, and so the decade from 1864 to 1874 was a period of transition from a military to a civilian occupation. Here's a slide of Tauranga in the late 1800s, and it was considered by those at the time to be a quiet little town with a European population of around 1,250 people. In the next decade, there was much development, and Tauranga was declared a port in 1873. The town wharf at the end of Wharf Street, up here, was built around 1871, and the second wharf, Victoria Wharf, was built around 1877. At this time, there was lots of uncertainty, but there was some feeling that Tauranga could go ahead. Growth tended to be progressed by families with capital and the will to cultivate the land. All the trade of the area had to pass through Tauranga. However, by the end of the decade, New Zealand entered the Depression years, and the government decided to close Tauranga as a port of entry and to withdraw the collector of customs. But then along came James Mann. James Alexander Mann was born in London of Scottish parents, and by the time he arrived in New Zealand in 1881, he was well-travelled and a well-educated scientist and trader. Mann foresaw Tauranga's potential as a major port, and so from 1882, Mann began making arrangements for the construction of the Tauranga Bond Store. This was going to be the base for his importing business, Mann and Co. The building would also act as a bonded store. The 1970s and 80s were boom decades for this type of warehousing in New Zealand, particularly in the main centres. So Mann purchased the premises at Section 1 of Tauranga from William Floyd, and this is where our archive collection begins, in 1881, with Mann's records. James Mann put out a tender for the work. The collection shows quotes from Thomas Whitaker And David London, a former mayor of Tauranga and builder. In those days, people tended to have multiple job titles. And here is a slide which shows the memorandum of agreement signed between Mann and Co merchants and Thomas Henry Whitaker, bricklayer, to build the warehouse on allotment 5 of Section 1, Town of Tauranga. So James Mann had his bond store built. It was well situated at the north end of what was the main commercial street, the Strand. The large hotels were nearby, and also the native hostel just next door, or the Mortiti hostel. It was also just across the road from Joseph Brain's shipyard over here, and only around 25 metres away from the shore, at least when it was built. The two main wharves were within a few hundred metres of the store. And once the store was built, however, he still had to acquire the bond for the warehouse. So what is a bond store? Bond stores were warehouses where imported goods were held under customs control until duties were paid to a collector who acted on behalf of the government. The collector paid a government bond as an insurance policy to ensure the government would be paid for duties and taxes collected. And we have correspondence in the collection which relates to the insurance for the goods from Standard, Fire and Marine. And this was for the payment of the government bond by James Mann for £1,000. Here's the deed, which bears the red wax seal of Mann and Co merchants. During these early years, settlements in the Bay of Plenty were dependent upon sea transport for communication with other districts. And from 1881, a weekly service connected Tauranga, Whakatane, Ohiwa and Ōpōtiki with Auckland. However, with the construction of roads and railways, the dependence on the sea gradually disappeared, and the steamer passenger service to Auckland was abandoned. So after more than 25 years, James Mann sold the business in April 1908 to Guinness Brothers. And here is a receipt from J.A. Mann to Guinness Brothers, being the second instalment of agreement for purchase of business at £1,800. James Mann was in business for over 25 years, and the significance of building the Tauranga Bond Store was noted in this Bay of Plenty Times obituary for him in 1923. But for his enterprise in taking over the government bond and building the bonded stores and his large direct importations from London, Glasgow and New York, Tauranga would have been closed as the customs port. To his perseverance is due the fact that the port of Tauranga came to be and is still figuring alongside the largest ports in all the published through freight lists abroad. So who are the Guinness Brothers? Well, if you haven't heard of the Tauranga family, I'm sure you've at least heard of the Guinness brew from Ireland, because they are connected. Arthur Guinness was the founder of the infamous Guinness Brewery at St James Gate in Dublin, and it was one of his grandsons, Francis Guinness, who travelled the world and ended up in New Zealand. And it was his fourth son, Frank Guinness, who met Jessie Bannatyne, whose family was in the hotel business in Otago, and they together were the licensees of several Dunedin hotels. However, this Frank died at aged 44, and he left his wife Jessie and 7 children. She remarried John Green, and they had one son together. And it's 2 of these sons of Frank and Jessie's, John, who was known as Jack, and Sid, who we refer to at the Tauranga Guinness Brothers. So they are the great-great-grandsons of Arthur Guinness. So Jessie and John Green and the family ended up moving to Christchurch first and then Tauranga in 1908. With the boys' future in mind, Mr. Green purchased a business from Mr. Mann. It consisted of direct importing business, a wholesale wine and spirit license, farm machinery, and a retail store. And with their background and family connection with Arthur Guinness, it's perhaps inevitable that the family should again be involved in the liquor trade. Here is a document in our collection that is significant. So in 1909, the government was again contemplating closing the port of Tauranga due to the drastic drop in revenue. However, the Guinness Brothers wrote to the Minister of Trade and Customs to try and persuade them otherwise, and they were successful. Here is the letter from the Department of Trade and Customs in Wellington, and it confirms the continuance of the port of Tauranga as a customs port. Here's a great photograph of the Guinness Brothers in front of their thriving store. This is possibly around mid-1900s. So the fortunes of the port and the warehouse business actually changed for the better by 1914. Business also picked up as Guinness Brothers were importers, producers and stockists of agricultural equipment, and they played an essential role in the development of the Bay of Plenty's industrial and agricultural industry. Sid and Jack even had their own dairy farm at Ohawiti until around 1930. And to promote the sales of these implements, Guinness Brothers attended all the agricultural and pastoral shows on the East Coast. And here's an example of one of those, and this is at Nicholson Field, which is now Tauranga Boys College Field. There were lots of ups and downs throughout their time in business, such as 2 world wars and changing land use, but the Guinness Brothers adapted well and business expanded. There was quite a demand for alcohol, and they also supplied guns, ammunitions, and explosives. However, with the advent of tractor-drawn implements in Tauranga District and the Bay of Plenty, Guinness Brothers gradually reduced their activity in implement merchandising and turned towards selling home appliances. They became one of Fisher and Paykel's earliest dealers, selling washing machines and fridges, and they also repaired them. So by the late 1950s, the once flourishing customs bond store business that James Mann had started was non-existent, as most of the goods now went through Auckland and the main port had moved over to Mount Maunganui. The building that Guinness Brothers originally occupied was 2-storied with a benzene store. Guinness Brothers added a small shop on the bond store's southern side and a workshop and bulk store at the rear. The shop was later greatly enlarged and rebuilt of much more substantial materials. It served as the main retail area of their business for many decades. By 1968, Guinness Brothers employed 25 staff, and the company owned 3 premises in Tauranga and 2 at Mount Maunganui. The business and its owners were an important part of the community and were prominent in Tauranga's recreational and social scenes. For instance, in 1916, Jack Guinness was the honorary secretary of the Bay of Plenty Jockey Club, and John Green was its president. And here's another item from our collection, a Bay of Plenty Jockey Club program. They also contributed towards World War I and II fundraising, the municipal band, the fire brigade, the Tauranga Borough Council, Tauranga Harbour Board, and the Orange Festival. John Green was an original member and former chairman of the Tauranga Harbour Board. He was a life member of the Tauranga Bowling Club and member of the Racecourse Domain Board. Guinness Brothers businesses remained in the bond store for 70 years, plus a further 8 years just for their wine and spirits business. When occupied by Guinness Brothers, the bond store was a familiar landmark and popular retail outlet. In 1972, a local historian noted, "The name Guinness is surely woven into Tauranga's past and present. It is an old name with a ring of quality about it, a quality embellished into a flourishing retail and wholesale business built from the sturdy independence, the faith, and the outlook of the brothers." So after the Guinness Brothers moved out, the premises were used by various tenants, and it was even converted into a cafe and bar at one stage. The building itself has had many structural and functional changes since 1882, but the characters can still be seen both inside and out, which has been preserved through the years, and it's certainly earned its way into Tauranga's history. Here it is as it looks today, and it's currently owned by Sun Media and still being used. Here is an old photograph that captures many elements of this collection. You can see the old pa site here and its proximity to the bond store, which is right up against it here. It shows the moat around the redoubt, which is still there. The upper left is the police station on the same site as it is now. And there's a small building in the centre above the moat, and that's the ammunition shed. The Guinness house is behind the cannon. So that's the Guinness family home. It later burnt down. And this is Jack Mann's house up here on Park Street. So this photo encompasses all the people involved with this bond store. And that brings us to the significance of this collection again. So why is it so significant, this bond store, in the history of Tauranga Moana? It's got a very historic site which is abutted to Taumataka Hawaii Pa. And it's also for the part James Mann and the Guinness Brothers played in the establishment of the Port of Tauranga as it is today. Also for its connection to families who became part of the fabric of Tauranga's social and economic history. And except for the bond store, nearly all the older buildings along the Strand have been replaced or remodelled. That brings us to the end of the talk. Thank you for listening. I hope you've learned something new and feel inspired to search through this collection or others online via Paikoriki. If you have any questions or would like to do further reading, please come and see us at Tauranga Library or email us on research@tauranga.govt.nz. Mā te wā.